Hello and welcome to another NASSP webinar. My name is John Nori and I'll be your moderator. The topic for today is what school leaders need to know about ELL, English Language Learners. As you participate in today's webinar, we invite you to expand the conversation on Twitter using hashtag NASSPwebinar. During the webinar, we invite your questions. Please submit them using the question box on your GoToWebinar panel. We'll respond to as many questions as time permits at the end of the presentation. And during the Q&A period, we'll do everything we can to be sure we cover all. If perhaps we run out of time or we don't get to a question, we'll try to respond to that for you and with you after the webinar is over via email. Technical slide is up at this time, and I want you to jot these numbers down. If you need assistance, call toll-free 855-352-9002, and make sure you have the webinar ID number with you, and that's 847-293-635. And I'll wait just a second. Jan, I didn't start the broadcast.
Oh.
So I have to go back and start as if.
Okay.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to another NASSP webinar. My name is John Nori and I'll be your moderator. Our topic is what school leaders need to know about English language learners. As you participate in this webinar, we invite you to expand the conversation on Twitter using hashtag NASSP, NASSP webinar. During the webinar, we invite your questions, and we'd ask you to submit them using the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel. I will gather the questions and give them to the presenter at the end of the webinar, and we will at that time hope to get through all of them. However, if we run out of time, we'll come back to you via email with answers to your questions as soon as we possibly can. If you have technical problems during the webinar, please call 855-352-9002. I'll give you a moment to jot that down, and also jot down the number 847-293-635. You'll need that as the ID, the webinar ID, if you call in for support during the webinar. We're on Twitter, as I said, at hashtag NASSPwebinar. NASSP is also on Facebook at facebook.com/principals. And this webinar recording will be on our website, nassp.org/webinar video, in about 2 days. Also, many of you I know will need certificates of attendance as a result of participating in today's webinar, and you can get that at nassp.org/webinar completed. Today's discussion is being recorded, as I said, and you'll be able to have access to that free of charge at nassp.org webinar videos. I'm pleased that Jan Dormer has agreed to be today's presenter. Dr. Dormer has extensive experience working with English language learners and teachers in diverse countries and contexts. An immigrant language learner herself at age 10, Jan added personal experience to her graduate graduate TESOL program at Messiah College. I'm sorry, I'm got lost in my own notes. Let me try that again. An English language learner herself, Jan adds personal experience to her expertise as a K-12 ELL educator. Jan teaches in the graduate TESOL program at Messiah College in Pennsylvania. Thanks for being with us today, Jan.
Thank you, John. It's an honor to be here.
At this time, I'd like to turn the controls over to Jan and ask her to take things away. Jan, it's all yours.
Thank you, John. I must say, in doing the research for my book, I developed even more respect for school principals and the very tough job that they have. And so it's with a little bit of trepidation that I'm speaking to you today, but I hope that something that you hear today can be helpful in your difficult task of meeting the needs of all learners, including those of the English language learners. I want to start with a little bit of background, and as John already mentioned, I did experience immigrant childhood language learning. I was born in Indiana, but my family moved from Indiana to Brazil when I was 10. Now the thinking of the day was children just soak up languages, so put them in a all Brazilian school. So I was placed in a Brazilian school that was all Portuguese. No one spoke any English at the school. It was extremely difficult and stressful, and I still remember coming home and crying myself to sleep every night. My parents eventually figured out that that was not a good environment for me and pulled me out of that school. Then we got a Portuguese tutor at home, and this tutor helped us learn the basics of Portuguese. Then my family moved to interior Brazil. Now, interior Brazil in the 70s was probably everything you could imagine that interior Brazil might be. It was a very substandard school environment by today's standards, where there were large class sizes. The first school, by contrast, was a private school with a low teacher-student ratio, but the second school was large. There were no textbooks. Our school classes consisted of going into class and copying down the textbook that the teacher had written on the board. So this second school was in no way a good school, but my experience in that school was actually somewhat positive. And so the only difference between that first school environment that was a good school and the second environment that was a poor school was my level of Portuguese. By then I had acquired enough Portuguese to make sense of the school environment, and I actually did well in that second school and enjoyed it, many things about it. And so I share that story to show the incredible importance of language for school success. Moving forward, I know that many people are a little bit frustrated with all the acronyms we use in TESOL, and so I just want to unpack a few of those here. TESOL is the Teaching of English to Speakers of Other Languages, and we use that acronym as a name for the whole field. Terms used for learners are EL or ELL, and most states choose one of those. So those are terms for the learner. And then terms for what the ELLs learn are ESL, English as a Second Language, ESOL, English for Speakers of Other Languages, EAL, which can be English as an academic or an additional language, and there are a few others like ENL, English as a New Language. Another term that's important to know, especially in terms of what beginning ELLs need, is ELD, English Language Development. So this maybe can be a cheat sheet for you to come back to in terminology. In this webinar, we're going to try to fly through these 5 questions, which are derived from my book. My book is framed around these questions. The first one, how can a good understanding of TESOL transform your school? What does it mean to know English? How does someone learn English? What factors impact the learning of English in school? And where can an ELL best acquire language and learn academic content? Moving to the first one, how can a good understanding of TESOL transform your school? So my framing of having ELLs in the school environment is a positive one. I really believe that the things that schools can do to embrace English learners are things that create a positive environment in the school in general. So first, this transformation can come by fostering a school culture which values and welcomes multiple languages and cultures. This includes providing training for all teachers on language and culture, getting rid of English-only policies, and fostering multilingualism. I've discovered that a lot of times people may not know as much about languages and cultures. Teachers may not know as much as we would like them to. And it makes intuitive sense that Well, we should require English only if students are trying to learn English, but we will see that there are reasons not to do that. Continuing on with the first question, another way we can engage in this transformation is by ensuring that teachers are qualified, skilled, and empowered. This includes hiring well-educated TESOL professionals as ESL specialists. We find that in some places the ESL teacher is only minimally qualified, is maybe considered an aide. Wherever possible, we want to move towards TESOL professionals and the view of TESOL, or that person who will orchestrate the meeting the needs of ELLs, as a professional position. And then that well-educated TESOL professional needs to be empowered to actually contribute to the decision-making in the school. Because another thing we're going to see is that the needs of ELLs come up in many different ways in the school. A big one being scheduling, for example, that TESOL professionals or whoever is the ESL person on staff needs to have a voice in those decisions. And then finally, equipping all teachers who teach ELLs with skills to further language acquisition in their classes. A big push now is to help all teachers embrace their identity as language teachers. This is not new. We know that all teachers are language teachers because even native English speakers are continuing to develop academic language through all of their school years. But not all of our teachers have embraced that kind of identity. I am a language teacher in addition to being a math teacher or a history teacher. So part of that is because they have not been equipped with the skills to have that identity. So that is one thing, and we're going to see further what some of those skills are. And the third point is by creating school schedules conducive to meeting ELL needs. We need to realize that ELLs at different levels will need to be in or out of different content classes. And that is something that is often not happening in various schools. Rather, ELLs are placed by school grade, for example, rather than by their English language proficiency levels sometimes. That includes the next point there, ensuring that intermediate and advanced ELLs continue their language learning through sheltered content classes or by having teachers trained in language and content teaching. That term, sheltered content classes, means content that is delivered in a way that is comprehensible to English language learners. So sheltering sometimes involves having a whole content class that is only for English language learners, and sometimes it involves having a subset of a class that are English language learners that are perhaps being taught by an ESL teacher within the content classroom. It can take different forms. But the point here is that intermediate and advanced ELLs can often have their needs met in regular content classes if they are receiving that content through sheltering methodologies or by specifically training those content teachers in language and content teaching. And some of these concepts will build on each other, and we will address this a little bit more in the future too as we go through the webinar. And the final point there is to prioritize the ESL specialist time with beginning ELLs when creating the school schedule. Often ESL teachers are kind of in a bit of a bind because there's a group pulled out to their ESL classroom that consists of various levels, and How do you begin to meet the needs of those beginner ELLs and the advanced ELLs within the same classroom space at the same time? It's very, very difficult, and it really is those beginning ELLs who need more of the ESL teacher's time. So, so that is one way forward in creating the school schedule that will kind of recognize these very different needs by the different proficiency levels. Moving on to our second question. The question is, what does it mean to know English? And again, this seems pretty intuitive, but there are two different perspectives, language as a system or language as communication. So a lot of times if you think about your English grammar class or whatever, you're thinking of English language as a system, the grammatical forms, the prefixes, the suffixes on words or whatever. However, when English language learners are acquiring English, they are acquiring the language as communication. And it is very different, and this is the difference between ELA, English Language Arts, and ELD, English Language Development. We never want to mistake those two because that could mean that our English language learners who need to be developing the English language are perhaps instead receiving English Language Arts instruction, and that is not meeting their needs. Of course, eventually English language learners do need that same ELA content, of course, but not at the beginning when they are struggling to develop a basis of the English language. So that kind of leads into our next point, knowing social and academic language. Jim Cummins differentiated between BICS, Basic Interpersonal Communication Skill, which takes 1 to 2 years to develop, and CALP, Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency, which takes 5 to 7 years to develop. So we can see there that it's a very long trajectory of learning. However, the social language, the BICS, can be acquired fairly quickly with the CALP taking a lot longer to develop. So when we ask what does it mean to know English, we also have to ask which kind of English, what kind of English. Are we talking about basic social English or are we talking about academic English? And the final point there is a language and culture. You can't know a language without knowing its culture. So this is why ESL teachers are trained to focus heavily on cultural understandings that come along with learning a new language. Continuing on with question number 3, how does someone learn English? What have we learned from successive theories, research, and current brain research about how someone learns English? I have a list here of what English language learners need in order to learn English. The first point, comprehensible input. ELLs need to understand what they hear. This point contradicts a typical notion that English language learners, especially if the younger they are, will just soak up language. That is simply not true. We do not acquire a language that we do not comprehend. The comprehension might be there because there are visuals, because there are gestures, because there's a bit of translation, because some language is known and we can comprehend what is unknown. But nevertheless, this point is very important. Comprehensible input, that is input meaning hearing or reading the language, is required for there to be language acquisition. And then ELLs need opportunities for output. They need the opportunity to speak. Output is speaking and writing, but in general it is the speaking that English language learners do not get enough of. They don't get enough opportunities to speak in school at the level at which they are capable of speaking. This can come through group work, for example, or pair work. These are wonderful opportunities to provide ELLs with speaking time. Social interaction. We know that language is acquired best through significant social interaction, ideally interactions at the language level that students are able to navigate. And a lot of times they can get that in regular classroom experiences, even with native speakers, if the teacher knows how to foster those environments. Low stress. We know that stress inhibits language acquisition. So any way that stress is coming at students, from testing to being in environments where they comprehend very little, those are all high stress situations that defeat the purposes of language acquisition. And ELLs need opportunities to read, write, speak, and listen that are meaningful and authentic as much as possible. They need corrective feedback, and this is one area where those teachers usually need specific instruction in how to provide that, because often teachers will use things like recasts that we know are not the most effective for English language learners. Teachers need strategies, appropriate strategies in providing corrective feedback. ELLs need some focus on form. The older learners do at high school level, but direct instruction on vocabulary and grammar is often overdone and not directly helpful for English language development. So we need some of that sometimes, but we often err in too much, not too little. And finally, the development of automaticity. Students need to learn a little language and use it a lot. They need many opportunities for repetitive practice of the language that they are learning. Moving on now, we're going to talk about some myths, and this slide will introduce the myths, and then the following slides will provide us with the facts. Myths about second language acquisition. One myth is that children learn languages more easily and quickly than adults. And the second myth is the more time spent in a second or foreign language environment, the more quickly the language is learned. And following from that second myth are two others. Children learning English will learn faster if parents speak in English at home. And the next one, the more children are immersed in English in school, the faster they will learn English. So let's unpack these myths. First, the myth about age and language acquisition. We know that children only have a distinct advantage in one area, and that is pronunciation. And if you can imagine a young child who has not been in the country very long, and yet the phrases and words that he speaks sound like a native speaker. And so we think, oh wow, how quickly they have learned. But in fact, pronunciation does not signal that a lot of language is known. It only signals that the native pronunciation of those words and phrases has been picked up. And children do have an advantage in this area. But the fact is that older learners have significant cognitive and life experience advantages. And so this is good news for high school age students. Of course, the younger the child, the more total time they have to learn. So the younger the better is true in the sense of having time to learn, of course, but older learners can acquire a language well. And this is the hopeful spot that we want to rest in, because given appropriate programs and opportunities, older learners can acquire a language well. And just to make a statement here that maybe can be helpful, why is the child's superiority myth prevalent? When a younger child sounds like a native speaker and has also mastered the relatively little language involved in BICS, remember that's our social language, it can give us the false impression of significant language proficiency. Older children and adults may know much more language and use it effectively for communication, but their deficiencies relative to native speakers of their age give us the impression that they know less than they do. So the older the individual, obviously, the more difference there's going to be between a native speaker and an English learner. And so as that gap grows, so does our perception that the language is not being learned well, when really, if we compared how much language is learned, older learners do not have a disadvantage. Now to move on to the facts about time and language acquisition. And the myth there is that, one that many people believe, more time in the language is more language learning, and those two equate. Well, there are downsides. Let me read through this fact. Though one can certainly have too little exposure to a language, there are downsides to continuous exposure involving input that is not comprehensible. As I mentioned earlier, comprehensible input is a key to language acquisition, and when a lot of time is spent hearing or reading language that is not understood, that is a significant downside. High-stress environments with few breaks from the difficult task of language acquisition. So imagine yourself being in a full school day in Arabic or another language that you don't speak, and you can just kind of think through and picture yourself in that setting and know how much you would want to be able to speak your native language at break time or lunchtime or whatever. So our English learners definitely need breaks from the difficult task of language acquisition. Devaluing of the native language and the impact of this on learner identity. So another problem in really believing that more is always better is a devaluation of the native language. We know without a shadow of a doubt that greater development of the native language enables greater development of a second language. There is so much research supporting this, that English learners are always at a greater advantage the more they can develop their native language. And so some time spent developing the native language instead of English is valuable for their English learning. And finally, lack of opportunity to use the native language as a learning scaffold for the new language. So we know now that students' active use of their native language in content learning, in perhaps group work, in vocabulary acquisition is a positive thing that can help them both understand the content, and it can further their English language understanding. Going on to the next one about families. Families should always continue to use the native language at home, because the more highly developed the native language, the greater the potential for developing an additional language. So I've already addressed that particular concept. And then also, parents are sometimes poor English models, where we're doing a disservice to the English learners when parents speak English poorly at home. And parents' greatest task at home is to parent, and they need to use the language in which they can best accomplish this task. One of the saddest things I see is when family relationships are skewed because a child is always interpreting for the parent, or the parent's role is kind of usurped in the family because the parent doesn't speak English and the children's English far outpaces the parents, and it just can result in problems. And so we want to support parents in their task of parenting and using the best language they have to do that. Moving on to question number 4. What factors impact the learning of English in school? And we're going to talk about a few different areas of qualities. We're going to start with the teacher qualities. Teachers need basically 4 things to foster language acquisition. 1, communicative competence, and this is simply the ability to speak English and speak it clearly and serve as a good model. Now, most of our teachers speak English as their native language, and we would think that this would not be a problem, but the more observations I do, the number 1 issue that I have to call to teachers' attention is that they are speaking far too quickly, and not enunciating their words, and not doing much in how they use the English language to facilitate the understanding of that language by an English learner. So if we could just get out to all teachers the need to speak clearly and serve as a good model, that would go a long ways. Second, linguistic knowledge, knowing how to explain features of the English language. Now, here is where, of course, there will be a difference between content teachers and ESL teachers. ESL teachers need to have much more knowledge of the English language, but content teachers can develop an understanding related to their content areas that would be helpful. And sad to say, our high school grammar classes don't help us a lot with this, because the way we teach grammar to native speakers does not focus on the grammatical issues that English language learners will have. For example, in your high school grammar class, did you ever talk about what articles mean and why they are important and when you would use a definite versus an indefinite? You know, those kind of things are not featured prominently in our grammar classes. So do content area teachers need to know all of this? No, but for example, a high school teacher can do some study and do some work in understanding the various past tense forms, because those will show up a lot in the study of history. And he could help those intermediate or advanced level history students in the history class, ELLs in the history class, to unpack those various forms. Similarly, a math teacher might want to know how to explain if-then structures in English sentences, because those might come up frequently in word problems. So there are things like that that even content area teachers who are not ESL specialists can learn and add to their ability to help English language learners. The third one there is theoretical knowledge, and this is knowing how people acquire language, and some of that we've already talked about, and usually a short seminar on that can be helpful to all teachers. Methodological competence is knowing techniques and strategies for fostering second language acquisition. Then we get to individual learner qualities, and these can come from culture, previous learning experiences, personality, and other areas. Things like motivation, identity, self-confidence, risk-taking, willingness to communicate. These are things we look for in strong language learners. Native language and culture, and the concept of language distance. We all know that we might all realize, if we thought about it, that a Chinese speaker learning English might have a greater difficulty than a Spanish speaker learning English, because the language distance between the two languages is greater. School qualities. So let's get down to what maybe interests the people in this webinar most, might be the school qualities. So efforts to individualize ELL placements. Now we're coming back to that theme that I've mentioned before, that placing ELLs in good learning environments for their English and their content has to be an individualized process. Efforts to nurture development of the native language. Even if there's not a strong population where you can do significant development, how can you help that one English learner who maybe speaks a language that no one else speaks? How can even that learner be affirmed in their first language? Efforts to affirm identity and foster motivation, and efforts to provide ELLs with well-qualified teachers both in ESL and content classes. And I ask this final question: what is the result of deficiencies in these areas? Long-term ELLs, and this is a situation that we're seeing in a lot of places in the country where where ELLs have been in ESL programs for 5 years or more. There's not total consensus on what constitutes a long-term ELL, but some places use 5 years. So when a school has not been able to provide these qualities, and then one outcome can be long-term ELLs, and in some places the number of students in the ESL program that fall into the long-term category is over 50%. And now we get to our last question. Where can an ELL best acquire language and learn content? And notice I've highlighted the word, the little article "and" there, trying to emphasize that this is an individualized placement. So factors to consider in placing this individual ELL. Home language and culture, what language is spoken at home, how big of a distance is that for the student to navigate. Previous education. Now we do have significant areas in this country receiving students with limited formal schooling, and these students have special needs. Aptitude and interests. I always say that despite everything you might do to place an ELL in the best way possible, if you do discover that a child is being pulled out during a really cool science class that's learning how a cell phone works, and that student has shown a great interest in science, you're going to want to do everything you can to push that child back into that classroom for that unit. So aptitude and interest need to play a role in this as well. Classroom context. It's not just as simple as saying ESL class or content class. Often it does depend on knowing the teachers of those classes. What is their training? What is their track record? What is the classroom environment like? And so it's a matter of knowing not only what the ELL needs, but what are the various classroom environment options as well. And finally, the most significant one is language level. Where is that ELL in the process of learning English? We typically have something like 5 or 6 levels in most of the paradigms that we use, and the lower the language level, the greater need the ELL has for language development time with the ESL teacher in an ESL class if possible. Sometimes co-teaching models can work well for that as well, but regardless, we have to take that into consideration. And continuing on with this last question, where can an ELL best acquire language and learn content? So now some of these terms and types. So push in, pull out, these terms are used in a lot of different ways. At their very basic language level, they just mean pushing this ELL into the regular content class or pulling them out for to an ESL class. And so those terms used in a specific school building need to be unpacked as to what they mean in that particular context. Regular content classes are a good place for many ELLs if the teacher has appropriate training. Sheltered classes, as I mentioned before, involve providing the content in a kind of in a simplified way for ELLs and getting the content down to its bare bones, perhaps. Co-teaching is an emerging model that can be very effective in some places. However, some places it's not as effective as it should be because there's not enough collaboration happening between the classroom teacher and the ESL teacher. So we have to use a collaborative model for co-teaching to work. And newcomer intensive English programs. So newcomer programs are ideal for students who come into the country and don't know any English. They're not always an option. However, there are features of a newcomer program that can be replicated on a smaller scale in an individual school building. And finally, ESL classes. And remember, we want those to be mostly ELD, English Language Development, not English Language Arts in their orientation. Moving on, just a little bit about assessment. Of course, this is a huge topic that goes beyond what we can talk about in this webinar, but in general, for language development, we want to emphasize performance assessment. It's always preferred to look at mastery and progress, and by performance assessment, we mean that students are actually reading, writing, speaking, or listening, showing what they can do in one of those skill areas. Of course, standardized testing is required sometimes, some places, for reporting, and it can be helpful for initial placement. When we measure progress, we do want to utilize teacher observation data and student self-assessment, especially at the high school level, in addition to test scores. So if at all possible, we want to have a multifaceted approach to measuring students' progress in acquiring the English language and feeding into issues of placement. Continuing on with this last question, keys to effective ELL placement. Now these have all been mentioned before, but I want to emphasize them more here. If possible, don't let scheduling drive placement. And I can hear, you know, just some sighs surrounding this, because I am aware that that is really difficult. Scheduling is a tough issue. So probably it has to drive it to a certain extent, but if possible, if we can develop kind of this filter that we do want to consider the needs of ELLs first before doing the scheduling and minimize the clashes that will emerge there. That could be kind of a helpful filter, perhaps. We want to individualize ELL placements, just as we might special education or other types of placements. English language learners have so many different individual factors that we need to consider. They are far from a monolithic group, and even those who are all beginners, for example, may have various differences, and so we do want to look at them as individuals. Always place ELLs in content classes when language and content learning can occur there. So sometimes I work with schools or teachers, and this is something I always come back to. If content and language learning is occurring, then it's probably a good place for the ELL to be. Sometimes I have seen ELLs pulled out when they shouldn't have been, when that meant that they were missing core content that they could have been capable of understanding and acquiring if the teacher had been able to use the appropriate strategies. Never leave beginning ELLs in content classes where they understand very little for large portions of the school day. And sometimes I see this, and ELLs can become very demotivated. They understand very little of what's going on. Sometimes this is because, frankly, the content area teacher cannot teach to that learner. That teacher perhaps has so much different differentiation going on, and the beginning ELL's needs are further afield than anything that can be reasonably accomplished in that class. So this is something to pay a lot of attention to. Where are the beginners? And are they getting that English language development that they so desperately need in order to facilitate their content learning? Ensure that ELLs of intermediate and advanced English proficiency have access to advanced courses. I mentioned this a little bit, and I think this is something that we have to take to heart, to not be pulling out intermediate and advanced ELLs in lieu of providing them with advanced level content. Finally, and we're on the last little bit here, and then we'll take questions. So placement by level. This might be a good slide to return to for just some general understanding. Level 1, beginners need significant pull-out time for ELD. Their main priority is to acquire basic English. Levels 2 and 3, high beginning and low intermediate learners need some pull-out time to continue their ELD, but can be well served for significant portions of the school day in content classes where teachers are trained to provide both language and content learning. Levels 4 and 5, high intermediate and advanced learners need to be in content classes where teachers are trained specifically in fostering language development alongside content. Access to content classes must include advanced placement classes. And then the final note, all content teachers who teach ELLs need specific training in teaching language alongside content. And what you see on the screen there now is my book, and I would like to say as well that this comes with an online component that has resources that you can download, sample documents and things like that. For example, I have a sample PowerPoint that could be used as a template for an orientation time for ELL parents, for example, and a home language survey and various other things. And we will continue to update that site with additional resources. So I would urge you to check that out. And now I will turn it back over to John for questions.
Thank you, Jan. We have a couple of questions that have come in. Some of them you touched on a bit, but let me put them out there and you can respond. How does an administrative team accommodate ESL students when there are deficits in staffing with the specialty?
Yeah. Well, I do think that part of the answer to that is this perspective of all teachers as language teachers. So, so training of content teachers with ESL methodology, I think that that would probably pay off over time in really meeting the needs of English language learners.
That goes to another question that I think is a little thornier. In communities where there's currently heightened resentment of non-speaking immigrants, what are best practices for advocating for special ESL schools, teachers, tutoring, etc.?
Yes, that's an important question, and I appreciate being asked that question. What we see in a lot of schools is a situation where ELL parents don't come or participate in parent-teacher meetings or parent events at the school, and a lot of times there's a misconception on the part of the teachers about why that is happening. Some teachers erroneously believe that that these parents don't want to participate, and I have never found that to be the case. And I have worked with a lot of ELL parents. So as I would be hopeful that as the school could intentionally draw those ELL parents in to interact with the other parents in the school in projects, in parent helpers, in rooms, as special speakers speaking about their culture and their country in classrooms. I would hope that that would help to to diminish some of that resistance. Often resistance comes because we simply don't know anything about that other group. And as we can bring groups in proximity with each other, I would hope that that could help. And I don't know if that's really addressed the question, but that would be the way forward I would look to.
Thank you. Thank you. Teachers are already overloaded with demands for differentiation. How can they possibly differentiate for each individual ELL as well?
Yes. I get asked that a lot, and I totally agree that teachers are often overloaded with demands for differentiation. So if a school is able to only require that kind of differentiation for the intermediate and advanced ELLs in the class, that lessens the teacher's burden. Now ideally you also don't have the beginners sitting there in the class not being attended to. You don't want that. You want either someone sitting there with the beginner to help or the beginner pulled out to an English language development class. However, that is where I would differentiate for the teachers. I would say your main job is to learn how to further the language development at the intermediate and advanced ELL levels. And we're going to help you know how to do that. And we're not going to demand of you that you also be able to meet the need of that beginner who, you know, really doesn't know any English.
It's another question, excuse me, that's just come in. You mentioned to get rid of the only English policy. How do you explain it to staff that are against? I'm having trouble reading this. How do you explain it to staff that are against EL students using their native language because, quote, they don't understand what they're saying, and, quote, they're just talking and not working?
Okay. I would first present them with a lot of research. There is tons of research showing the advantage in developing the English language when students also are developing their first language. So that's the starting point. The research is solid on that. But then the other question that was mentioned, okay, teachers don't like not knowing what students are saying, and teachers fear that students are not doing what they're supposed to do. So the fear of not understanding what somebody else is saying, that depends on the context whether or not that's an issue. So if teachers, if it's in the hallway, honestly, why do we have to understand what they're saying? So I mean, context goes to a little bit of that. And part of that is growing pains on the part of teachers, developing this school climate that does encourage the use of other languages. In my book, I extend this to foreign language classes. Why do we not encourage our foreign language students to speak French or German or whatever in the hallways, in the lunchroom? We should be encouraging that, right, as we develop a multilingual environment. Now, if the teacher has allowed students to do group work in their own language in class and they're fearful that they're not doing what they should be doing, so that's in how group work is set up, with enough checks and balances, like okay, within 3 minutes time I want you to have this response and then this one, and you know, really setting up some tight controls around that group work so that if you know, if students don't do it, they don't succeed in the task, and there are ramifications for that, such as perhaps, well, not being able to speak in their first language. So those are the kinds of things I would try. I do appreciate that it is a learning curve for a school to become a multilingual friendly environment. This is not something that is part of the school culture in many places, and it would take time for teachers to buy into that. one thing I do when I go speak at schools and give some training, I give classes in the two languages that I speak are Portuguese and Indonesian, and so I will give some classes in one of those languages, and teachers experience what it's like to be on the receiving end of content delivered in a foreign language, and that often develops quite a bit of empathy.
That leads right to the next question, and that is, I'm surprised we're using the term ESL when so many of our students are learning English as a third or fourth language. Why don't we stop using that term?
Exactly. I agree with this comment totally, which is why in my book I use the term ESOL, ESOL. That is the term that I use, English for speakers of other languages. No term is perfect, and ESL is so entrenched that that is the term that, you know, many places still use. But I agree, and for that reason my book doesn't use it.
And last but not least, I think I'm getting all the questions now. They're scrolling here. We have someone asking about the PowerPoint and will it be available. And I know your PowerPoint was jam-packed with facts. And
Yes.
so I'll repeat that. When the webinar ends, we'll upload this to the NASSP website within a few days, and you'll be able to get not only a recording of Jan's presentation, but also the PowerPoint will be available to you.
And I would add that my email address is on the screen, and I'm happy to be contacted as well.
Great. Thank you, Jan. Give it another second or two to see if there are any other questions that pop up. I think I got them all. Let me just scan one more time. There was one about testing, and I've kind of lost it in the stream here, and I'm trying to go back and pick it up. The question, I'll try to reconstruct it from memory while I look. It's talking about holding students accountable for state-mandated, here it is, let me read it verbatim. What are current best practices for helping ESL students perform successfully on state-mandated graduation tests?
Oh my. Well, as you can probably imagine, that does depend, that does vary from state to state, and this will not be a satisfactory answer to your question, but here's what I would say. Many people erroneously believe that we can do something magical to make students do well on tests above their level of language proficiency, and that just is not possible. If students have the language proficiency to navigate the test, they can do well, they can show their content knowledge, right? If they don't, there is nothing magical we can do with them to help them do better than they are, to do better than their English level warrants. So the best thing we can do is get that English language development in there in a strong fashion, and continue that through the academic language acquisition that can happen in the content classes through well-trained teachers. All of that is what is necessary to do well on state-mandated tests.
And I have another question. I think that the asker is making a great point, and that's, how do you explain the levels to staff that are not open to understanding because the EL students speak some speaks some English, they have not academically ready to perform in English? How do you explain the difference? How do students even get disciplinary actions because of this, because they don't understand? So
yeah, which is really sad.
Yeah.
So I find that the Bix and Kalp paradigm resonates well with teachers when we explain that basic interpersonal communication skill versus the cognitive academic language proficiency, which takes a lot longer. Teachers can usually go, ah, yeah, that makes sense. So so that resonates with teachers. They usually can buy into that, and other things are getting them to understand things like playground language. Okay, how many words and phrases do you think are used on the playground? And actually, it's such a low number. Now imagine that if all of your assessment of the student's language was coming from what you hear on the playground without thinking about how different that language is from the language used in a math class. Those kinds of things can help teachers kind of have some aha moments.
Thank you. And here's another question that just came in. Please talk more about the sheltered content classes. Do high school students attend and receive high school credit for sheltered classes?
Okay, yes, and I will direct you to one of the best known systems for sheltering is called the SIOP model. That's SIOP, Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol, that is owned by Pearson. So that is something that you can look up to get more understanding of sheltering. The SIOP model is not the only one, but it's a well-known one. So sheltering really can happen in a lot of different forms. Yes, in many forms of it, and this would be a good scenario if a school can do this, provide credit, high school credit for a sheltered math class or a sheltered science class, for example. Yes, that is very appropriate if the same content is being delivered, and that is the idea behind sheltering, that we can deliver the same content with a lower English language load, at least in some content areas. Math and science being a little easier to do that with than, say, history or literature. But yes, that's the idea. But in some places there would be sheltering without high school credit as well. There's a lot of variation in how it's done.
Thank you very much, Jan. I would like to just step back and say I really have enjoyed this opportunity to participate in this webinar with you, and I'd like to invite all the presenters to come to Philadelphia July 9th through 11th, 2017. Connecting great leaders across all levels. For the first time, the National Association of Secondary School Principals and the National Association of Elementary School Principals will co-sponsor or co-offer a National Principals Conference, and Jan will be one of the speakers there. So if you've gotten a taste of ESL from her presentation today and you'd like more, you can come there and meet her in person and learn more about ESL and how principals can respond to ELL learners. Jan, thank you again. I really appreciate your work today, and thank you to all the folks who have stayed with us and been a part of this webinar today.